Hello, my friend. Hello, my friends. I'm Deepak Chopra, and I'm here with Eddie Stern. We've been having these conversations on the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, and at the moment, we are speaking about Vibhuti, attainments, siddhis, and going beyond the usual bandwidth of human experience, which is very limited and which we take for granted and which determines our experience of everyday reality through what is called the conditioned mind. So every choice that we make, normally speaking, is filtered through the conditioned mind, which has many names, ego mind, limited identity, limited awareness, personality, etc. Then the conditioning goes deep: parental conditioning, family conditioning, cultural conditioning, economic conditioning, racial conditioning, historical conditioning, on and on. We can go back to our histories of colonialism and conquest and subjugation, and all of this in simple language in the Eastern wisdom traditions is called karma. So karma is just past experiences, past choices, and some of them we made consciously, some we didn't make consciously. And then we also interpreted our experiences in different ways. So we've all walked through different gardens, knelt at different graves, worshipped at different temples, and every wisp of experience has been metabolized into what we call the karmic body. This, what you're looking at, is the karmic body. It's the reflection of the internal conditioned mind, whether it's sensations, images, feelings, thoughts, interpretations, whatever, leading to karma, sanskara, vasana, all of which we've discussed. But now we are in this very interesting chapter that talks about vibhutis, and we're talking about three practices which you can revisit in our previous conversations: dharana, focused awareness, frequently also said, frequently also spoken of as concentration; dhyan, the flow of focused awareness, as in meditation; and samadhi, transcendence, the fusion of the object of perception with the subject; and then sankalpa, which is intention, that orchestrates the fulfillment of the intention and liberates you from karmic conditioning. So that's basically why we're doing these vibhutis and talking about them. We spoke last time with Eddie on time, mastery of the understanding of time. Today, Eddie would like to discuss words. And so, um, first of all, welcome, Eddie. We're going to talk about vibhuti of words. Now, of course, anytime I hear the word, there's this phrase, and first there was the word, and word was made into flesh. And I actually believe that. I believe that every word that we use in any language is basically a sound, what we call shruti, and then the meaning that we give it is comes from the habit of using that word in the past as something we agreed to, and so that's called smriti or memory. And between those two, the word actually captures not only the history of experience and karma, but also the word evolves. We have words evolving all the time, acquiring new meanings, the matrix of interdependent languages. So many words now in English come from Hindi, and they come from Sanskrit, and there's Urdu, which is a combination of Persian and Hindi, on and on. But they determine our reality. If you have a word for something, you have an experience for that. If you don't have a word for something, there's no experience. And so I'd like to understand from you a couple of things. When I practice my own spiritual practice, I go through very many phases of doubt. I also go through many phases of validation. I also go through many phases where I question human constructs. And so, because human beings have language for narrative and story and all of that, we have scientific language, we have mathematical language, musical language, we have linguistic language, we have symbolic language through hands and body language and gestures and facial expressions. It's all language, it's all symbolic representation of experience, which we call karma, sanskara, vasana. But the question I have always had is is language an impediment or is language actually revelatory? And in the beginning, I had a lot of doubts about language actually being not a revelation, but an impediment. We created language. But then I also had this idea that language is part of human evolution, and human evolution is part of planetary evolution. Planetary evolution is part of cosmic evolution. So the universe must have intended language, and therefore we can use it, language. And we can access deeper knowledge, modes of knowing through language. But at some point, we have to also transcend language for pure knowing. So that's my introduction. And I'm going to ask you, Vibhuti on words. What do we get out of understanding the Vibhuti of words and why?
Well, thanks for that introduction. It's also very interesting to hear you speak about words, considering that you're an amazing writer and prolific at that. You've written a lot of words and thought a lot about words in particular. And when we talk about words, we're talking about communication. And when we're talking about communication, we are talking about the sharing of experience, whether that experience is a feeling, a thought, an idea, a demand, a wish, a correction, or whatever. And this idea of, are words an impediment? On a certain level, they are going to be. And that's one of the reasons why in this particular Vibhuti, there's a very long commentary about the nature of words. And earlier on in chapter 1, actually, not in chapter 1, in this chapter 2, later on, we're going to see, in chapter 2, forgive me, we're in chapter 3 now. In chapter 2, there was a little bit of a discussion about words already, and this was in regards to satyam, which is speaking the truth or honesty. And for that person who is established in satya, in truth or in honesty, whatever words they say will come true. The things that they say will manifest as reality. And so now we find in chapter 3 this idea of, okay, well, we know there's this power of communication, but what are words essentially? And that's what this Vibhuti is speaking of. So the Sutra 317 says that the word object and the idea of them overlapping produce a unified impression. So you have a book sitting next to you, and it's your book. So when I say that book, Total Meditation, I used the word book, the Total Meditation title. I was pointing at the object which is next to you, and then there's an idea of what a book is. So there's that particular book written by Deepak Chopra, and there's also the idea of a book, that there are many books that have words in them, and they communicate ideas, different types of ideas. But that entire thing gives a unified impression, because if I say Deepak's book, we know who you are, you're the object that I've identified, we know what a book is from prior knowledge, and there's an impression embedded into it, which is due to language, culture, ideas, the evolution of ideas, etc. But then I take all that thing to be a real entity. So if the Samyama, the Dharana, Dhyana, and Samadhi is practiced on each of those things separately, the word itself, the object, the idea of that thing, and the knowledge of the meaning of the sounds that are being created, which means the syllables that make up all of the parts of a word, then the understanding of communication all across the board is mastered. So therefore you understand because you've basically meditated on the syllables that make up words and not given into the impression that the object is creating in your mind, and being convinced that that impression of the thing is real, but you begin to, I don't want to say deconstruct it, but you examine it, you meditate on the sounds, the true nature of the thing reveals itself. And what that does is it reveals the knowledge of all language, meaning the language of animals, the language of nature, the language of all different types of languages. So it's said that Lord Krishna, because of course he's the omnipresent, omniscient, all-knowing Lord, one of his gifts is the gift of language, that he can understand the language of every being and every mode of being, and communicate on that level. So that's something that always really, I loved that about reading the stories of Krishna, because this mastery of language, being able to communicate and understand what was being communicated by every being. I thought, like, how wonderful would that be to exist in a world where you understood the language of the stars, in the language of the clouds. And if you look to certain Native American cultures or indigenous cultures, whether it's Aboriginal or Maori or whatever, the communication that they have with plants and with trees and with the soil is completely different than the language I was, raised with. And so we can expand our ability to understand what other life forms are telling us if we learn how to tune into them. So this idea of mastery of sounds, and by understanding sounds, and by sounds we mean syllables or impressions of sounds, the potentiality for communicating experience. By understanding that, we understand how they evolve into words which represent objects. But because we understand the substrata, we can understand any manifestation of that sound, whether it's from a cat or someone speaking in a different language. And so that's basically what this Vibhuti is about. It's also dealing with sequences. When we talked about time, we had past, present, and future. But when we look at words, we're also looking at the articulation of sequences, because a word starts, it has a middle, and a word will end. It's made up of, the syllables that go in a row. First we have the B, and then the O, and then the O, and then the K. So all of these sequences, when we dive into them, we begin to understand what the sequences of time, what the sequences of words are conveying. Now, let me give a little bit of a better example of how that could be. When we talk about articulated words, and there's a huge, I'm not an expert on this topic by any means at all, but the philosophy of spota in the Hindu tradition is basically what do words mean, the articulation, and all philosophers talk about what words mean. But you said a very particular thing, are words an impediment? And if we look at a teacher like Ramana Maharshi, he was known as the silent sage for a long time, and people would come to him and they would sit in silence with him, and he would look in their eyes and communicate something beyond words with his eyes, through their eyes, so they would have the experience of what he was communicating. So this was a transmission of experience without the use of words. Now we wonder, okay, well, how's that possible? Is that like a really woo-woo thing or some sort of a spiritual thing? Well, if we look to even modern, quote unquote, modern science, we know that as human beings, and even with animals and other types of life forms, that we co-regulate each other through facial expression, through the way we use our eyes and our smiles, or if we frown. We transmit the sense of safety or the sense of danger just through our presence. And you told me many, many years ago of a study that showed that if you had someone who is extremely angry and the walls of their amygdalas were thickening because of their anger and their fear, if they just had someone sitting there listening to them like neutrally listening to them as they express their anger, the walls of the amygdala would start to thin again and the anger would dissipate just because they were seen, just because they were heard. And that's all they needed. So that, we do have this co-regulation of response between us as human beings and with animals as well, and plants. And so therefore, for Ramana Maharshi to communicate something to us without the use of words, but through his eyes, it's a very tactile physiological experience. Now, what about the people who weren't able to get what he was saying without words? Then he would resort to speaking. They would, if someone came and was quiet and sat in front of him, they could receive quiet. But if someone came in front of him and their mind was agitated and they needed to verbalize or articulate a question, he couldn't answer that question with silence. He would have to meet that question with articulation and the use of words in space and time as well. And so that's how we have a written record. If everyone came to him in silence and received in silence, then there would have been no record of his teachings. But because many of us come with agitated minds and we have a jumble of thoughts, we're not met with silence, but we're met with articulation in space, in time, with syllables, objects, and meanings associated with each of those words that we superimpose our ideas upon. And now we have to unravel them for true meaning. And so to not get lost to the superficial use of words is one of the very important stages that we go through in a meditative practice. And otherwise, we stay on the surface level of the syllables, object, and meaning. But now we want to go below that, deep to the silence. And I think that's one of the beauties as well of, Maharishi Mahesh's teachings on how you use a syllable, that then helps you go below all the articulations. I think, am I incorrect that today is Maharishi Mahesh's birthday as well?
Yes, today would have been 103 today.
Wow. So and so with mantra,
Going to silence for a couple of weeks before the 12th. And
uh-huh.
on the 12th, he would announce the theme of the year. And so at the Chopra Global and Chopra Foundation organizations, I'm about to announce the theme of 2021 in honor of Maharishi. And here is the theme: transformation. Deity, Durga, and Shiva. Element fire. And this is the year of transformation for us.
Beautiful.
In honor of Maharishi.
Beautiful. Jai Gurudev.
Very good. So, okay. So now taking that, now since we brought up Maharishi and we know that each of the chakras has a sound associated with it. Huh? Lam, Vam, Ram, Yam, Ham, Om, Sham, etc. These are the Bij mantras for the sounds, but there are basically sounds, right? And so do they have any significance, deeper significance other than just being sounds? Lam, why is it the first chakra? Why is Vam the second chakra, etc.? Is there a reason? What do they represent? And why are we using those sounds?
Okay, so all of those sounds of the chakras are called bija mantras, as you know, and this means a seed sound. A seed contains within it the power of whatever it's expressing. So you plant a, banana tree, and banana tree is going to grow. Apple tree won't grow. And the same for all other trees, oak trees and maple trees, etc. And they all come from a seed. And we also come from a seed. And, whatever power is contained in the seed of the sperm and the ova, that's what we grow into. Sounds as well carry power within them. And there are certain sounds that were heard by the rishis, by the seers, by the listeners, that they discern to have particular powers too. And that through the repetition of them, you would have the experience of what that sound carried within it. Now, I don't think I can shed a whole lot more light on it than that. Where did the sounds come from? They existed. They were heard. Why does anything exist? Where is the universe? Those are all the same types of questions. So the hearers of the mantras in their meditations discerned somehow that these particular syllables had inherent powers to them, and through repeating them, the power of that sound would blossom or grow in you, and then you would be transformed by it. So lam is the symbolic representation, or the sound representation of earth, associated with the sense of
Well,
smell, and also representative of Ganesha, Lord Ganesha, who is the earth element deity. The power of Ganesha, the remover of obstacles, the Lord of wisdom, the gatekeeper, is through repetition of lam. The Ganesha Upanishad begins like that. Om lam namaste ganapataye tvameva pratyaksham tattvamasi. You are the visible manifestation of tattvam asi, of I am that. O Lord Ganesha, you're the visible manifestation, and all of your power is contained within the sound lam as well as gum. So this is the science of mantra.
and so the more I think about this, man, of course, refers to the mind, human, woman, man. Man is mantra is an instrument of the mind which helps us go beyond the karmic language that we normally have in the internal dialogue. So, if I close my eyes, I hear my story, whatever I'm thinking of at the moment. But if I use a mantra, then it takes me away from that karmic story. And the mantra, of course, is also the symbolic representation of a higher consciousness, deity, whatever. So it takes me from the ordinary internal dialogue, which is my karmic history, and towards Ishta Deva or whatever that is encapsulated in the sound. But there are moments in meditation where mantra and thought cancel each other out, and there's no mantra, there's no thought. All there is pure consciousness, and that's how we use the Bij mantras in meditation practice anyway. But is it true, I'm asking you this, that if you take all, and let's stick with one language, Hindi or Sanskrit, since those are the languages of these wisdom traditions, is it true that every consonant has a location in the body and every vowel actually is the non-local vibration? Because vowels are everywhere. K here, L here. There are labial sounds, there are nasal sounds, all kinds of sounds. Okay, what do you call it? Dental sounds, breathing sounds. But when we use e, o, oo, these you can direct. And I was part of the Nada Brahman classes in the old days, where we would direct vowel sounds to different parts of the body just to bring awareness there. So the vowel sound was, it's non-local, but it can be localized. And then the consonants already have a location. And so between them, you have the vocabulary of biology at the level of sound. And then, this is what Nanda Brahman would mean, but then you can go further and you can say that each of these sounds and each of these consonants, ka, gung, gum, yu, these are nature sounds, and the combination and alchemy of the sounds produces all language, whether it's animal language or the rustling of trees during a breeze, or the sound of a cuckoo bird, or the mating call of a finch, or the sound of a whale. They're the alchemy of these sounds. So is is there a process of some samyama that we can do to master the vibhuti of words or sounds? What is the process? if any?
Uh, well, the process in Yoga Sutra is number one, mastering the dharana, dhyana, and samadhi, and the ability to have an impression being made in the mind of the very same thing and only that very same thing. So when we talked about the transformation of consciousness last week and the week before also, that there is this idea of something called the ekagrata parinama and the nirodha parinama. And the ekagrata parinama is where when the mind is, because the mind is a substance and it's always changing. And now my mind is changing with different thoughts coming through it all the time because I'm talking to you, I'm listening to you. You know, I respect and admire you, so I want to sound smart. I want to make sure whatever I say is good. So, and you know, maybe there's an audience who I don't want to look stupid in front of. So going on in my mind is anything but yekagrata parinama. I'm not having a transformation of my mind right now of only one thing and then that one thing and then that one thing. I'm having a whole bunch of thoughts. I'm thinking forward in the future, planning my words so I articulate. Now, if I had ekagrata parinama, that would mean that the transformation of my consciousness would be one thought, and then the arisal again of that same thought, and the arisal of that same thought. And so imagine a candle, and you have a flame burning, and we looked at the candle flame, and we think, oh, that's just a flame burning. But that if we look deeper at that flame burning, it is the transformation of the same substance and the same energy moving in the same pattern so that flame remains constant. That flame is an activity of constant repetition of the same activity until the flame goes out. And so that repetition of the same activity, arising, 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 appears like it's continuous, but actually it's a constant transformation. And so that is dhyana. That is the steady flow of awareness with the same arising again and again and again in that transformation of consciousness. And so, number one, I have to be able to do that. And then number two, I have to be able to do the next type of parinama where there is not even a transformation. There's only one thing being held in the mind that becomes so ever present that the idea of me as a meditator falls away. I no longer exist, only the object is existing. And so this is the samadhi. So the samadhi parinama, where there is no more me, there's only the object, means that I can place any object in that field. And the dharma, or the defining characteristic of that object, will then become, I will have the experience of what that defining characteristic is. So if I put words or a mantra into that field and that object becomes my entire experience, I'll understand the meaning, the purpose, and the characteristics and the articulation and communication of that particular word. And I will become that word. I will understand it. I will be the word. And so that's how we understand all language, through, you know, it's not just thinking about words, it's first being able to do dharana, dhyana, and samadhi, and have that transformation of consciousness and the ability to become one idea, one thought, one experience. And then we can apply that to all the different objects of the world and understand what those objects are, including things like we talked about, like friendliness or strength, or meditating on the kantakupa or the kurmanadi. And then we get the power of that meditation, that object. That's revelation also.
All the sutras, you know, whether it's this sutra, Karmanari, or subdued hunger and thirst, or knowledge of the body, or knowledge of time, it's just Samyama on a particular motif or theme or story embodied in that word, so that the entirety of that knowledge is revealed, but it's not knowledge that you know, it's knowledge you become. So you now can communicate with the bird. I've met people who do that. We normally, people communicate with their dogs and cats and they don't think much of it. And yet, when you communicate with your dog, let's say you call your dog Yoda, okay? And say, Yoda, come here. The dog probably doesn't hear the word Yoda because it has a different nervous system. It translates it into whatever bandwidth of acoustic ability it has, matches it with its nasal experience, and yet communicates with you, even though what the dog is experiencing is nothing like what you said, Yoda. Okay. And I've met people who communicate with birds, who communicate with other animals, and I also had the experience in stillness in the Himalayas, sitting in a hut, meditating and watching a mouse next to me. And I could control the movements of the mouse by just my thoughts and my movements and my breathing. And it was mirroring me. Everything I did was mirrored. But I had no idea what the mouse was experiencing because it's a completely different nervous system with some parallels, of course, to a human brain. But still have no idea. I can't even think what you're thinking. But now have a mouse replicate my behavior was pretty weird. So at some level, at the level of sound or vibration, or excitation or whatever we want to call it, Shakti, or, you know, there is Purusha and then there is Prakriti. And Prakriti is every possible, um, every possible vritti. So thought is a vritti, okay, sound is a vritti, and sensation is a vritti, and image is a vritti, and emotion is a vritti, and they're all entangled in the word. And I was thinking, did the word come first or the sound came first? And obviously, the sound came first, then the word came, and the alphabet came last. Okay, we broke down the experience to an image, then gave the image a sound name, and then actually dissected that sound into syllables and sounds, the alchemy of which is all language, or it's the entire communication, symbolic expression of the matrix of sentience. So therefore, the sounds now, mantras uh, and syllables, make a lot more sense actually, because by doing sanyama on these sounds, they reveal the deity or the theme or the motif or the higher consciousness or the symbolic representation of a mode of knowing which is beyond ordinary modes of knowing.
Yeah. And, and beautifully said. And I think in line with also ways you speak about it too, that a vibhuti is the full total removal of a veil of misperception. And what it does is it radically increases our bandwidth of experience of the thing that we are meditating upon. And so when we talk about hearing, when we do the Samyama on hearing, imagine if the bandwidth of hearing becomes, you can hear the sound of a black hole, or you can hear the sound of an atom. And that's what Yoga Sutra says, that you can, when you have mastery of chitta, you can expand your awareness to be as large as the infinite or as small as an atom. And I don't think Patanjali means that as hyperbole. I think he means that this is the absolute removal of bandwidth, which limits us to thinking that we understand things the way that they really are and the way we think that they should be. So it's a removal of the limitations.
It's vritti and it's the source of all vrittis. Yeah. Shiva and Shakti, Purusha and Prakriti. This is what it is, right?
Yeah, it is. And when you talked about the language existing on different body parts, it definitely in the tantras, we see the depictions of the letters of the Sanskrit alphabet placed on all the different parts of the body that exist as mantras. When you do ritual, you place the different devas on the different body parts to sanctify and awaken the devas that are existing within us. The 12 names of Vishnu, or the 24 names of Vishnu. Keshavaya Namaha, Narayana Namaha, Madhavaya Namaha, Govindaya Namaha, Vishnave Namaha, Madhusudanaya Namaha, etc., etc. And you sanctify your entire body to align your consciousness with the Deva, with the Supreme Being, before you begin to worship. And it's only in that alignment of your vessel with the divine, now you can form a relationship. And so you awaken all of these different parts of the body where the mantras and the devas are lying dormant, as well as in the mouth or in the eyes or on the feet or wherever. So yeah, there's a tremendous, amazing science of mantras made up of syllables, of sounds in all those traditions. And the 52 letters of the Sanskrit alphabet are the matrikas. These are the sound embodiments of the Divine Mother.
Matrika, Mata, Mother, Matrix, time,
Yeah.
music, measurement, Matra is measurement of the infinite as the finite experience, basically.
Yeah.
And this Matrika is the mother that gives birth to the relative, in a sense, from the absolute. Well, this has been very good. I think we've given our audience enough uh, information to see many things. One is, my own experiences with great masters. Whenever I ask them questions, they never answered right away. There was a gap of silence. And then the answer would come as if from the absolute. There was no desire to impress, there was no desire to convince, cajole, or defend, or anything. It was just a revelation that came spontaneously from the depths of being, that little pause. You're hearing, letting it sink in, and then you're allowing whatever comes spontaneously. It just becomes very revelatory. So, recently, because I have these conversations with scientists and physicalists, if you talk to reductionist physicalists, they don't believe in free will. They say, the laws of nature determine everything, and free will is an illusion. Talk to yogis, they say free will is liberation. And think about this really. Is there free will or liberation? I think they simultaneously exist. They are complementarities. The conditioned mind is determined through karma, and the liberated mind is awake to that conditioning. But then, some people, scientists, neuroscientists particularly, they start quoting Libet, that the brain responds to intention even before you're aware of the intention. That's an argument against, by the way, it's an argument against free will, that the brain responds to an intention even before you become aware that you have the intention. Yesterday, I spoke to Mimi Guarini, who's a cardiologist. She says the heart responds even before. So, as soon as you have an inkling that something is going to happen, the heart changes its activity, then the brain changes, and then you become conscious as a thought. So now everybody uses this as an argument against free will. But as you and I have talked before, even thought and words have a sequential unfoldment from para to pashanti to madhyama and vaikari. And actually, if you look at that sequence, para, totally unmanifest. Pashanti, a cloud of probabilities determined by karma. Then pashanti para pashanti madhyama, internal dialogue, karmic body. And then vaikari, this body in speech and the world. This is almost like collapse of the wave function. The wave function is all possibilities. Then the probabilities are determined by the patterns of previous collapse. Okay. And then you suddenly have probability, a space-time event, which is a thought. And then you have collapse of that, and then there's matter or experience in the physical world. You've traveled from the causal body, from Brahman to Atman to Jiva, to the subtle body, Manomaya Kosha, in this sequence, Para Pashanti Madhyama Vaikri, to the physical world. In fact, you're dealing with all the koshas just in the unfoldment of thought. And as you begin to witness this, and I do this, I can see at night, thought emerging. And where is it coming from? Because I'm not thinking it, it's just emerging. Then I see these probabilities, and then there's a clarity of one thought and two thoughts, and then a theme and internal dialogue, and then the physical world. And I realize that it's the depth of your awareness that determines the difference between bondage and creativity, between determinism and freedom and moksha. And so it's not one thing or another. It's the witnessing of the whole process, which I think is ultimately the vibhuti of words, of thoughts, but they're entangled with every other experience we have. And so understanding the sequence, all possibilities, probabilities, cloud of probabilities, space-time events, physical reality, this is the yogic explanation of creativity and creation, all of creation. Because those sounds are not only in the human language, those sounds are everywhere. Same sounds
They exist as potential.
as everywhere.
Yeah.
Okay.